All right. So they are simple-celled, without organelles that are bound by membranes. So as far as their nutrition, how they obtain energy, they're autotrophs. They can acquire energy in a variety of ways through using different chemicals, using energy from heat. They have sort of unique means of obtaining energy in a lot of cases. They reproduce asexually, so they basically just split in two. They copy their DNA, split, and then you have two organisms. So that process in single-celled organisms is often called binary fission. So binary, do you know what that means? Like the actual word itself? So like the root comes from bicycle, binary code. So binary code, what, Diksha? Yeah, it means two parts. So binary fission means to split in two parts. For example, in Star Wars, episode 4.
You're talking to me now. A New Hope.
A New Hope.
The two planets?
So young Luke Skywalker is gazing out, longing to do something and get off this planet. And what is he seeing in the distance? Two suns. The setting of two suns, because Tatooine is in a binary solar system. Thank you, Colin. So, and his hair is blowing in the wind. Yes. Okay. Quick trivia question. Where was that filmed? What? Tunisia. I believe it was in Tunisia.
Jake said
Tatooine was not actually filmed on Tatooine. All right, anyway, that is called a binary solar system. A solar system has two stars in which the planets orbit around is a binary solar system. Binary code is made of a series of zeros and ones. There's only two phases that the information can be in for each bit. So that's where binary comes from. So binary fission means to split into two parts. You have a simple cell. The DNA in prokaryotes, remember, is simple. It's not in the form of surrounded by a nucleus with multiple chromosomes. They often have this ring-shaped loop of DNA in their cells. It copies, the cell splits, and now you have two organisms. So examples include extremophiles, okay, that can live in a variety of conditions. So archaea have been found all over. Some examples of the names they were given, those archaea that can survive at high temperature are called thermophiles. Thermo meaning having to do with heat. Some can survive at extremely low temperatures, so they're called cryophiles. Cryogenics.
Cryogenics, isn't that where you
Is
sit in a
freezing
big
when
tube?
people freeze themselves.
Yeah.
Cryotherapy.
It's kind of similar to Luke's thing in episode 5 where he's floating in that bed when it's
Yeah.
I hate
Is that the same?
yeah,
All right. So some can grow in extremely dry conditions. They're called xerophiles.
The forensic files.
Xerophiles, like xeriscaping with an X, is what you see in like houses that are built in desert locations. Often they don't have grass growing outside, but often they have like a little landscape of cacti and sand and stones. That's called xeriscaping. Halophiles. They don't love to play the video game, but they do live in high salt concentrations.
Did you say X-Files? That's not sure.
Barophiles can live in very high pressure environments, like deep in the ocean floor. Okay, so these extremophiles can live in areas where no living things were thought to be able to exist. So scientists have questioned, and this is something they still don't know the answer to, is this some of the earliest life on Earth, these extremophiles? Conditions on Earth after its cooling and formation were quite a bit more extreme than they are today. And so maybe these organisms evolved to be able to live in those conditions. Then we move on to the next one, bacteria. Domain, bacteria. Kingdom, bacteria actually has a Latin name as well. Kingdom is called Monera, but we'll just call it the bacteria kingdom. And when we list out these characteristics, they're going to sound very similar, right? They're unicellular, prokaryotic, no nucleus, no organelles. However, for these bacteria, some are autotrophic, some are heterotrophic. They also have a cell wall. It's something often used to classify some of these organisms. But it's a different type of cell wall than a plant. It's made of different material.
If like a scientist were to find like a bacteria and an archaea, and like, how would they be able to tell, like, since the archaea is autotrophic, and that bacteria can be auto or heterotrophic? If it's autotrophic, how does it know that it's not just another
Yeah,
archaea?
good question. Because originally, when Archaea were first discovered, scientists kind of taxonomically lumped them in the bacteria kingdom. They said, well, because of those reasons. They're prokaryotic, unicellular, they must be a special type of bacteria. But then what happened is they actually started analyzing their DNA and found that it's actually quite different from the DNA of bacteria. And so that's when they split them off into their own domain. But good question. Bacteria reproduce asexually, also through binary fission. There are lots of different types of bacteria. Some examples of some names: E. coli, Salmonella. These are some rod-shaped bacteria, E. coli. These are some tiny little
Ew,
bacteria
look at
growing. This is the
maggots.
head of a pin. That's how small bacteria are. Quite small. Like, I've tried to have students observe bacteria in our light microscopes, and you can barely see them. So they're really small.
That is, wait, like the head, like
The
the
pointy part.
Wait, can you go back?
What?
Pins aren't pointy.
Yeah.
Pins aren't pointy.
Oh my god, dude, that
It
is so.
doesn't look, it doesn't
It
look
just-
pointy.
Doesn't look sharp.
And it also is.
All right, so we name bacteria
Crackly.
sometimes using a series of different prefixes that can sort of describe the bacteria. So bacteria come in a few main shapes. There are rod-shaped bacteria like a cylinder. There are spherical, round bacteria. And then there are also these sort of corkscrew bacteria. And so they have names for each of those shapes. So the rod-shaped bacteria are called bacillus. The spherical bacteria called coccus.
Who could heard that?
You have.
Streptococcus.
And the twisted ones are called spirillum. And then we have a couple prefixes that are used. If they grow together in chains, the prefix used is strepto.
That's
If-
so cocky.
If they grow in these grape-like clusters, the prefix is staphylo. So yeah, so now you're starting to recognize some of these. You've heard of some bacteria before, and now the name should make sense. What's the name? Raise your hand if you can reason out the name of this type of bacteria. Is it? That's streptococcus. Okay, why strepto?
Because they're circular and spherical.
Yeah, they're strepto because they're in a chain, coccus because they're spherical. So those two things make the name. What about this? So why have you heard of streptococcus?
Strepto.
That's what causes strep throat. What about this? Reason out the name of these orangish bacteria, Lily. Yeah, staphylococcus. This is what causes a staph infection. If you ever heard of a skin infection, or an infection. Sometimes people get in wounds.
I thought you were just gonna leave it at staff, like a computer.
How about
staff.
this? Colin?
Streptobacillus.
Yeah, streptobacillus. All right. Let's So these bacteria are used to make lots of food. Many foods that we eat that are fermented
Like wine.
or curdled, things like cheeses, yogurt, beer, wine, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha.
Cream cheese.
All of these foods are made using bacteria in the
I
process.
love food, is what I'm just
Right.
saying.
I like burritos. Oh, I can tell now.
Where does bread get its fluffiness, Swiss cheese its holes, and what makes vinegar so sour? These foods may taste completely different, but all of these phenomena come from tiny organisms chowing down on sugar and belching out some culinary byproducts. Let's start with yeast. Yeast are single-celled fungi used to make bread, beer, and wine, among other products. Yeast break down carbohydrates like sugar to get energy and the molecules they need to function. They have two different ways to do this: the oxygen-dependent or aerobic pathway and the oxygen-independent anaerobic pathway, which is also called fermentation. When you bake bread, yeast can use both pathways, but they normally prefer to start with the anaerobic process of fermentation. In this process, ethanol is produced in addition to CO2. No, bread isn't alcoholic. Small amounts of alcohol that are secreted evaporate during baking. In the aerobic or oxygen-dependent pathway, the yeast consumes some of the sugar and produce carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, and water. In both processes, the CO2 accumulates and creates tiny bubbles. These bubbles get trapped by gluten and create a sponge-like structure that gives the bread its soft texture. Wine also relies on yeast, but a wine-making setup keeps the oxygen levels low, so that yeast consumes sugar using fermentation, the anaerobic pathway. The process often starts with wild yeasts already hanging out with grapes. But to get consistent results, most winemakers also add carefully selected strains of yeast that can tolerate high levels of alcohol. The yeast consume the sugar in the grape juice, and as the sugar level drops, the alcohol level rises. This doesn't necessarily mean that sweeter wines have less alcohol. Different types of grapes start with different amounts of sugar, and sugar can also be added. What happens to carbon dioxide? It just bubbles away through a vent. In carbonated alcoholic beverages like champagne and beer, sealed containers are used in primary or secondary fermentation to keep the carbon dioxide in the bottle. Wine also introduces us to our second type of food-producing microorganism, bacteria. A special strain of bacteria turns a tart compound in grape juice into softer tasting ones that are responsible for some of the flavors in red wines and Chardonnays. Another type of bacteria, called acetic acid bacteria, isn't so desirable in wine, but they have their function too. If there's oxygen around, these bacteria convert the ethanol in wine into, well, acetic acid. Let this process continue, and you'll eventually get vinegar. Bacteria are the key for cheese, too. To make cheese, milk is inoculated with bacteria. The bacteria gobble up the lactose, a kind of sugar, and produce lactic acid, along with many other chemicals. As the milk gets more and more acidic, its proteins start to aggregate and curdle. That's why spoiled milk is clumpy. Cheesemakers usually add an enzyme called rennet, naturally found inside of cows, goats, and some other mammals, to help this process along. Eventually, those little curdles turn into bigger curds, which are pressed to squeeze out the water and create a firm cheese. Different strains of bacteria make different kinds of cheese. For example, a species of bacteria that emits carbon dioxide is what gives Swiss cheese its characteristic holes. Some cheeses, Brie and Camembert, use another kind of microorganism too, mold. So your kitchen functions as a sort of biotechnology lab, manned by microorganisms that culture your cuisine. Yogurt, soy sauce, sour cream, sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, cheddar, challah, pita, and naan. But maybe not all at the same dinner.
All right, so we use those bacteria all the time. We also have bacteria that live inside our digestive tract. They help us to digest certain materials we otherwise couldn't digest. They produce some vitamins that we need. So bacteria actually, don't just think of them as something that causes you to get sick. They actually have a lot more beneficial uses than they do harmful uses. All right, so we're going to really spend the rest of the week on the Protist kingdom, because we're going to be looking at some Protists. So remind me of what domain we are talking about when we're talking about Protists. Ella? They're eukarya, correct. And the kingdom is Protist. The Latin name is Protista. And Protists are unicellular, eukaryotic, and auto or heterotrophic. Generally, we find them living in water. If you were to go to a stream or a pond near your house and scoop up some water, look at it in the microscope, it's likely that you would find a variety of protists living in that water. They reproduce, they're also, some of them are parasitic. We'll talk about this towards the end of the unit. Some of them can cause illness and disease. Have you ever heard of amoebic dysentery? Anyone ever heard of that?
I heard of dysentery.
Yeah, so amoeba, there are some types of amoeba can cause dysentery. They reproduce asexually through binary fission to produce copies of themselves. Remember, in asexual reproduction, only a single parent cell is required, and all the offspring end up to be identical to each other. Here you have a diagram of a single parent cell, an amoeba, splitting to form two daughter cells, two amoeba. We're going to talk about a little bit further detail in terms of the Protist kingdom. We're going to actually talk about a variety of groups of Protists. And Protists are generally placed into groups based on their movement, their means of locomotion is what we say. Because amoeba move in different ways. So first of all, what we're talking about are called protozoans. These are animal-like protists. So there are all sorts of plant-like protists. So there are four groups of protozoans that are split up according to their movement. So one type are the amoeboids. The amoeboids move using this process in which they just sort of ooze their cytoplasm forward and then kind of pull themselves along, kind of oozing forward, and they just sort of scream from place to place, kind of like maybe Jabba the Hutt.
Oh,
They don't have no limbs but just sort of.
He's got arms. That's not
He's
true.
got arms, but he doesn't walk on them.
Yeah, but he eats
So his
them.
bottom half, he just kind of.
He does like make them with the wings.
Sure, he does eat those little snacks.
Yeah.
So they move, that process is called moving using pseudopods. That means false feet, like pseudo means like false.
Like a pseudo.
The root pod, yeah, like pseudonym. Pod, that root. Do you know what kind of doctor people go to that helps with foot problems?
Orthopedic. It's a thing.
The
Protists.
is a
No one's done one.
A podiatrist.
No.
That's what I said.
A bone doctor.
An orthopedic, yeah, works on bones. So a pseudopod means false feet. Those little extensions that they lob forward, those are called pseudopods. And that's how they move around. It's also, as you're going to see in a minute, how they engulf their food. Other types of protists are called ciliates. They move using a little part called cilia. Cilia are like tiny little hairs that surround this protist. This is a paramecium. And all of these little hairs all sort of beat together at the same time, paddling it around the water. Like a million little oars paddling this thing through the water. That's a paramecium, a cilia. A flagellate moves using not a whole bunch of these tiny cilia, but using one large, you might call it a tail. It's called a flagellum. And the flagellum whips around or twists around, dragging the organism through the water like a propeller almost.
That makes sound like they would be on a restaurant.
This is a euglena. A euglena is the example we're going to look at of a flagellate. Then the final one are called sporozoans. These don't really move on their own. They are often parasites that kind of hitch a ride inside other organisms. And sporozoans, such as Plasmodium, often cause disease. And we're going to talk specifically about Plasmodium. The Plasmodium causes a disease that affects millions and millions of people. It causes a disease I'm sure you've heard of. It's a disease that is mostly a disease of the tropics.
It's
What's that?
malaria.
Malaria.
The one with the
So Plasmodium causes malaria. It's spread by mosquitoes.
That's it. The suckies.
And we'll talk more about malaria as we get towards the end of this. So it affects blood cells.
That's also like Africa. It's sucky.
All right. So let's talk about the amoeboids, the ones that blob around, oozing forward to go from place to place. Yeah, no, called pseudopods. So these are pseudopods, these extensions of their cytoplasm.
I listen to Power Rangers. Oh my god,
They're sort of called like temporary feet that go forward to either move or also to engulf their food.
Gross.
What happens with amoeba is they just sort of blob over, they extend these pseudopods on each side of their food, surround it, and then when they connect on the other side, now that piece of food is inside of the amoeba. It's in a food vacuole.
I feel like I've seen one of these things.
So if I were to draw a picture, this is a delicious piece of amoeba food, and this is our amoeba. So what they do is they would send forward a pseudopod. You get the point? Send it forward. Eventually they connect. And now, where's this food?
In the top.
It's inside the amoeba. And now we would call this a food vacuole.
Wait, Chad.
And then the amoeba would secrete some digestive enzymes in here to break down this food particle and then absorb the nutrients. So the pseudopods are used for both movement and for ingestion of food. The food vacuole is what's formed after the food has been engulfed. This little video here will show just, you can see how the cytoplasm of the amoeba sort of moves. This is somebody took through a microscope. And you can sort of see the cytoplasm just kind of moving. It doesn't happen really quickly, but you can see inside that cytoplasm moving around.
What do they eat?
They'll eat like bacteria or other protists, little bits of organic matter in the water. Just sort of anything that has nutrients in it. So you can see that amoeba moving up. Now the other issue with many of these protists is they live in fresh water. And that poses a problem. It poses a problem because of another topic we've already talked about. What typically happens to cells that are placed in fresh water? Osmosis causes what to happen to them? They expand because fresh water is 100% water. Inside the cytoplasm of these organisms is not 100% water, it's 90 or so. So water is going to diffuse into them. And that would cause them to swell up, expand, maybe burst. So many of these freshwater protists have a special organelle called the contractile vacuole. And the contractile vacuole acts almost like a pump. As water flows in, this vacuole fills up with water, it squeezes and pumps the water out of the protist to allow it to maintain its balance of water. So that's called a contractile vacuole. In the amoeba, you don't see it very clearly, but in Paramecium you do, and I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. No, sorry, I'll go back.
Are we, did we get a test back
I don't know. The ciliates move using cilia, these tiny hairs that are surrounding the outside of the organism. The one we're going to look at is called Paramecium. The Paramecium has sort of this, it looks like a footprint shape, and it always has that same shape. It doesn't have a flexible outermost layer like the amoeba does. It has a shell around it. So it always has this very distinctive shape. It moves using the cilia that are around the outside that kind of paddle it through the water. And like I said, it has this shell called the pellicle. It's the coating around the outside that gives it that distinctive shape. But this poses a problem in how it obtains food. Because it has this hard shell around the outside, it can't engulf its food like the amoeba. Instead, it has some specialized parts to do that. This indentation you see here and here and here is called the oral groove. It's like its mouth. It's used to ingest food. Someday when I start my band, that's going to be the name of the band.
Mouth ingestion?
The oral groove.
That's stupid.
I also am inventing a new brand of sneakers called Mecium brand sneakers.
I would, they better be cool.
Yeah. So you can buy a pair of Mecium on my website.
Yeah.
I even have a logo developed for them.
Maybe you can actually find
The
a
bottom
place
is going to be shaped like this. It's going to be really cool. It's going to have the organelles and printed on the bottom. Custom painted to order for each person. So once they're online, I'll let you know and we can order a Paramecium.
23andMe situation where they go to a river bed, scoop up some water, and then the Paramecium in that water, you take those, you like look at it through a microscope, and then you make a custom one of that water.
Maybe I'll do that. That's maybe phase 2. All right, so the oral groove leads into a tube called the gullet. And at the end of that tube is a little vacuole, which sort of stores the food that's ingested by the Paramecium. So that's how they take in food. And then that food vacuole can move around, can be digested by enzymes and so forth. And again, because they have this hard outer shell, waste products can't just diffuse out of the cell membrane as they could in amoeba. So they have an opening called the anal pore in which waste products leave the Paramecium.
For one.
So in this picture, this is an electron microscope image. You can see all the cilia on the outside of the Paramecium. When we look at them in a light microscope, it's a lot harder to actually see those cilia, but they are there. All right, we'll finish up tomorrow by talking about flagellates.